You're listening to episode 327.
Welcome to Transforming Missions Podcast, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
I'm going to start this episode with a big question to introduce the topic for this episode. Tim, who influenced... Sure, I'm going to ask you the question. Tim, who influenced you to be the leader you are today?
Sarah, I think the best way I can answer that, it depends on which season of my life that I've been in at a given point in time. I have lots of people who've influenced me. And just to go down a list of people very quickly, you've heard me talk more than once on this podcast about my fourth grade Sunday school teacher. And she wasn't talking necessarily about leadership, but she had a great influence on me in terms, as it obviously is, on what it is to be a follower of Jesus. And that for me is at the heart of being the leader, a Christ-centered leader. And I had teachers, professors as I went along, and they were people that what I called, I was a sneaky feeder. I would watch them and then pick up things that they were doing as I listened and learned from them. There have been people in local churches, whether I just admired or there was some kind of a relationship that we could develop. And I can just remember one of those being, he was the superintendent of the state police for West Virginia. He became a very good friend, and he did leader development among state policemen, and I paid lots of attention to him. And there have been others, whether they've been colleagues or people in congregations. I've had colleagues who have been very influential in who I am and what I do today as a leader. So it's a season that I'm in at any given time.
So you figured out what our topic is for today, and that topic is leadership. So the next question that I have for you, Tim, is what experiences or habits fuel your leadership?
Well, that's a good question. For me, everything that I do is out of a pattern of just trying to love and care for people the way God's loved and cared for me. Now, I don't always get that done, but that I want to deal with people the way I want people to deal with me. So those are things that I've learned through just being a follower of Jesus. The other things that I've learned, and some of these, Sarah, you've taught me, so it keeps me young when you teach me things. But just the idea of authenticity and being authentic, those were things that I'd always heard. But through your work and your study, you have modeled those. And the one big one you've done is just being generous with people, not going to the worst place to begin with, and trying to put myself in the place of people and why they respond the way they do. Those are some of the experiences, some of the habits. I go through a thing every day that, I pray and there's scripture. I don't mean to say it that it's not as important. But there's an end of the day where I do reflect, and we mentioned this at our last podcast. There's an end of the day reflection as I think back upon the day and how I could have, what are the things to celebrate? What could I have done differently? Who are the people that I need to connect with, either to apologize for being a idiot, me being the idiot, or people that I contact just to tell them how much I appreciate who they are, because I'm becoming more who God would want me to be. So that's something that happens every day for me in terms of a habit. But I think that makes me the better leader by doing that. Does that answer the question?
Yes. This isn't a test. It's just sharing with people what experiences or habits, and you did that. And hopefully, as I'm asking Tim these questions and as he's sharing, you're also reflecting as listeners on not only his answers, but how you might respond to these questions as well. Are you ready for the next question?
Sure.
What wisdom, have to throw that in there at some point. What wisdom can you offer about identifying emerging leaders? And we use that phrase, emerging leaders, in lots of different ways. So let me say it a little bit differently. What wisdom can you offer about cultivating leaders? That's prayerful work. It's intentional work, and it's more than prayer. And sometimes I think this sounds snarky. Nominations committee is going to meet. Let's pray that somebody comes to mind so that we can fill that slot, which is neither intentional nor is it prayerful. So how can leaders multiply leaders? Because they're seasons, right?
So, Sarah, I'm always looking, and it's not my judgment. It's just the way people respond to people around them. So I'm always looking for people who model the love of God that they've experienced in and through Jesus. And one of the ways that emerging leaders for me are people who actually have some humility, that it's not all about them, but they're willing to, that they're what we would call lifelong learners. They're always learning. They have enough self-awareness that they're not trying to be the smartest person in the room, that they can listen. And of course, that goes along with the learning, but they don't have to let everybody know how much they know. But it comes out when it's needed to come out in a grace-filled, humble way. There are good preachers. There are sometimes good communicators that are good preachers, and I like that. But if they don't pass these other tests, what if you stand up and can talk, but you can't walk the talk? Why would we want you to be preaching? If we think of it in terms of that, there are people who care. I always look. This is me, and I'm speaking out of experience for me, and that is when people are in caring ministries, I look to see if that's a genuine kind of care, or are they doing it because they have some weird need to be needed. Well, and let me give you a kind of a humorous situation at this point. Has little to do with leadership, but it shows up in terms of our leaders. And that is, I'm in a season of retirement, and there are people that want to show their appreciation, and that's good. I appreciate that. They congratulate me, and I said, what do you congratulate me on? That I'm stopping doing what I've done all my life? Or they'll say, well, we need to recognize you in some way. And finally, I got tired of it, and I said to one person who was doing that, you don't have to recognize me. I know who I am. I know how people appreciate it. I just don't feel like I want to give people an opportunity to feel good for themselves because they got to do something for me. That's what I mean about people that are caregivers, but they do it more for themselves than they do it for the people that they're caring for. Does that make sense?
That is such an authentic expression of Tim bias. It's not even funny. Oh, goodness. So, can I ask another question?
Sure.
The last question was really about the succession of leaders and developing a pipeline of leaders, if you will. But I've also experienced you developing leaders and investing in leaders, people who have responded to that invitation, and you're seeking to cultivate them in some way. So the question is, what is important to consider when developing leaders?
Well, Sarah, you're always intentional about it. So it doesn't happen haphazardly. So just because if you're working with a staff, just because you have a staff meeting doesn't mean you're developing leaders. So one of the things that I learned to do, and now I have to go back and say part of the reason I did this is because of my need more than the need of the person we were cultivating until later on, is that let me do it with staff first. And that is, I met with each staff person individually each week with the question, what do you need from me to do what you're doing? I mean, you may tell me what you're working on. I may ask you how that's going. What do you need from me to continue to do that? That was always an invitation for people to be themselves, but it was also, and maybe now I'm giving myself a little more credit, it was also a place where I could be generous with people. I didn't have those terms then, but it was a place to be generous with people, to allow them to, if things weren't working the way they needed to work, it wasn't because I was telling them something. It was because they were being able to articulate it for themselves and where I might be able to help them. That's one of the things. Working with teams, it gets more complicated the more people who are involved. If you're doing it with individuals, it's not easy, but it becomes a place where you develop relationship and there's trust that you develop. And in that midst of that trust, you're able to have give and take. The same thing happens with teams, but if you have more than 2 or 3 people on a team, you got to develop trust with all of them, and they've got to have trust with each other. And that takes a little longer and it's a little more in depth. And how do you do that? Well, sometimes in the business world, you develop trust by doing activities together outside of the workplace so they can trust each other. And we've all read about crazy things like going on some kind of all-day experience where people had to trust each other to get through the experience. I think that's fine. I think if we start with Jesus and how Jesus loved us, and we can love each other at that point, and then have the authentic enough to be able to say, if we can't trust each other, then what do we need to do to get to that point? That's being vulnerable, but if the vulnerability is not there, you're not going to get the development of leaders. And part of that, I've just learned that, and this might have been an answer to a previous question, but again, this is that sneaky feeder stuff. I've learned in the church that there are certain people that can help you with leader development. And you teed me up with this one at one time, but that's some of the best people I've had as leaders have been educators, because they work with people and they deal with people every day. And it's not a matter of, a lot of times with educators, it's not a matter of a bottom line. It's a matter of human development. And when I mentioned the state policeman I worked with, it was always fun to talk with him because he wasn't talking about law enforcement. He was talking about how he could develop younger people in the work that they were doing.
You've already started to answer my next question in terms of, I'm going to turn the table a bit if I can, in terms of what do people need to be led well, or said differently, what are the needs of followers? And you named one of those needs already, and that being trust. Are there others?
Well, yes, there are. And I learned these from you. I think they come from a Gallup survey, but I don't know that I would have known that if I hadn't heard them from you as we've worked together. But trust is one of those. There are 4 things that Gallup found that were needed. Trust. Compassion was another one of those. If people knew that they were cared for, or they look for leaders that care for them. Stability, that is another. And that was good for me to know, because lots of times when you lead through change, there's not the stability that everybody wants. But the idea of stability, and I'm going now to the Bible, and that is one of the things you can read from Matthew's gospel when God sent Jesus to teach us how to live a righteous life, is that a lot of the things in Matthew are just basic things. There's no big surprise. And the image I have for stability is you've got an 18-year-old that's gone off to college, and everything that they've known in life, which was mundane, and they can't wait to get out of there and get to some place that's a whole lot different, and they've got the freedom, and they go off and spend a semester and they learn about all the freedom and all that. And they come back home, and the first thing they say, well, it's the same old stuff. Nothing's changed. It's just the same old stuff. But the reality is they need that more than they needed the freedom. And if I may say it that way. And that's what people look for in stability. It's not the same old stuff. It's the foundational pieces that can't be taken away. There'll be change. There'll always be change. But God's the same today and yesterday, today, and tomorrow. God's love doesn't go away. And those are the things you hang on for stability. And then for hope, hope's a big one for me, as we've talked about. And that's more than wishful thinking. It's not sitting here saying, well, I hope we can get through this. And I think maybe we'll talk a little more about this, that hope has its own power, that when you really focus upon it, about making it come about. So yeah, this is what people look for in leaders. And I think if we could talk with more leaders about focusing on these four things, we'd be a whole lot more effective in sharing the good news of God's love.
Okay, so let's talk about each one of these, beginning with trust. And when we're recording this, it's change of appointment season, but this doesn't just apply to change of appointment season. It's anytime there are people in the room together, trust is important. So why is trust important, and what is needed to cultivate trust between clergy, staff, leadership, the church, and the community? You choose which relationships you want to name there.
Well, Sarah, you and I both know it takes time to develop relationships, to build relationships. One of the images I hold in is one that you brought back from Brene Brown, and that is the jar that you're dropping something into. What's that called?
The marble jar.
It's like you're developing enough currency. You're intentional about developing the relationship. You're looking for the best in people. And when I say you're intentional about developing the relationship or the trust, is that let's just take a change in appointment, and you're going to a new appointment. Have conversation with the people with whom you're going to be working most closely with. Ask them to give you 2 or 3 names of people that you need to talk with. And what you're doing is you're developing a trust with them, because you're asking them for some help. And then you're going to have conversation with some people to say, your name's come up to me that I need to talk with you. You're affirming people at that point. And then you listen to them. Even if the same names come up all the time, you now are knowing the people you need to keep close, because they're the people that other people listen to. And so that's one way of just developing some trust as you make the transition, if we just keep it in terms of appointment season. And the thing, again, that you've helped me with, and that is, you're always, and until somebody proves differently, always give people the benefit of the doubt. Just be generous with them. Of course, one thing I've learned is that if people tell you who they are, believe them. So you may have to start where they are to move along to where you would really like for them to be. So that's really quickly how you gain some currency and how you build the trust relationships you need to have. Just very quickly. Was that helpful?
Yes, very helpful. I'm wondering what breaks trust and then what rebuilds trust.
Well, I think one of the biggest things that breaks trust is acting on assumptions that you take as being reality. If somebody comes to you and says, so-and-so said, And instead of basing the assumption that so-and-so actually said it, why don't you just have a conversation with so-and-so? Yeah, you know what I mean? Give them the benefit of the doubt. Have the conversation. The assumptions will get you in trouble. Triangularization will get you in trouble. This is one of the biggies, and that is, and I'll do it in terms of being a district superintendent. I always told pastors that if somebody came to me with a complaint about them, I'll send them back to you. I don't need to be in the middle of that unless you want me in the middle. And if I get in the middle, you probably won't like the way it comes out. But that's one of the things that breaks trust. Because if we can't face each other, and this comes back again to the mission and loving one another as we've been loved, if we can't have face-to-face conversation, there's something wrong. I mean, that, from my opinion, I think one of the ways, if trust is broken, and of course it's tougher to rebuild the trust than it is to just build it to begin with. But I made a mistake. These are words. I made a mistake. I made an assumption about this. I acted before I talked with you about it. I think being vulnerable, those are words of vulnerability, and allowing somebody else to be caring and forgiving at those points instead of just digging your heels in and trying to be defensive and defend yourself.
Anything else about trust that we need to cover?
There's probably a lot, Sarah, but you're very kind to think that I have any wisdom about any of this at all. So no, not for now.
Okay, so the second need of followers is stability, and you've already named a little bit about that, being in terms of stability being about consistency and really not surprising people. So on this one, maybe the question is, what gets leaders in trouble?
Well, this will sound like one of integrity, but I think what gets leaders in trouble in terms of stability is saying one thing and then not following through or doing something else. That will create a culture of instability faster than anything, because instability comes when you can't be trusted, or there is a culture of mistrust.
Or when you say one thing and do another, or your response to every question is different in different contexts.
Right. One of the things I learned when I was working on the general level is that leaders sometimes don't know how to work with staff. And part of the reason they don't know how to work with staff is that they want to be liked. And one of the things that'll create instability very quickly is that you don't hold to you just don't hold to the mission with everyone. You do with one, and then you don't do it with another, and somebody gets a little favoritism or whatever, and then it all comes crumbling down because you want everybody to like you. If you're not healthy enough to have self-awareness or to be able to stand on your own conviction, then you're going to create a culture of instability, and you'll not be the leader you need to be at that point.
So I'm wondering if it's fair to say I'm thinking about expectations. And is it fair to say when people don't know what to expect, it causes problems for the leader and for the congregation?
Yeah, it's not, in my estimation, it's not a good thing it's not always a good thing when people say, we just don't know how you're going to respond. Now, sometimes they do that because they don't like your response. I mean, that happens. But if you're inconsistent in your responses to people, or if you've said, it sounds redundant, but if you've said one thing and then your response ends up being another, you're going to create an atmosphere that, if I may put it in a DS perspective, I'm going to get a call from the staff parish chair.
Yeah. And it's why stability is important and what people need.
And really, if you're going to move forward, as we've talked about in previous podcasts about a disciple-making pathway, if it's going to be centered upon the mission, if you're going to say that, which I would hope you would, but then you're not going to live that, it's difficult for people to feel like that they can depend on you as a leader.
Are we ready to move on to the third need of followers? You responded to that quickly. So it's been said that people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And I offer that to point to the third need of followers, which you named, which is compassion. And compassion is really about the people you're leading, knowing that you care. I haven't asked a question in this way yet, so I'm going to ask it. Is there a story that you might share with us that illustrates that compassion in and with leaders?
There is, but it's not, a lot of my stories are about me offering the care and compassion. It may be that, let me offer one that where I was the receiver of the compassion.
There he goes, turning the tables again.
And it's an illustration of what people need. So let me just do it this way. In my own life, when I've had a particular difficulty, and if it's me being, and I don't know the word depressed is a good word, but it's getting distracted off of who I am and what I'm supposed to be about, the compassion has shown up with individuals or an individual who would help me stay focused. And I think this is more the compassion that we're talking about than it is about somebody that says, "Oh, I know I understand how you feel, and I'd feel the same way." The compassion is somebody come alongside of you and not saying whether you are right or wrong, but regardless, I'm with you. We'll get through this together. I think that's what compassion's more about. And actually, as a leader, if you're offering that compassion and you say, "We'll get through this, it's okay," you're making yourself available, because when people are in pain and you're the leader and you've said, "We'll get through it," you sometimes have to be available when the pain's at its height. I only know a few people. Everybody needs that in a leader. And I think all leaders who have compassion can go a certain distance with that. I think that's just part of, especially in the church, we're kind of geared to that kind of care. I don't think everyone can go the distance with that care. There are only a few. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't strive for it by your own faith development and continuing to practice that with others. But I can tell you out of my own experience, it was not only life-changing, it was life-saving. And I think when people in the church feel like that their leader cares for them enough that they're available for them, that compassion does a big deal.
It's a good word. Are we ready for the last need of followers? Or is there something
Sure.
more that you want to offer around compassion?
Let me answer it this way. I don't care. Let's move to the next one.
Oh, goodness. So I opened myself up to that one. So when we talk about hope, especially here on the podcast, we can talk about it in two different ways. We talk about hope as an acronym for a discipleship pathway, which we talked about on the last episode. We also talk about hope in terms of thinking about the future and thinking about that future with, you can't define something with the word in it, but I'm going to do it with a hope-filled future. There's a positive future that you're looking forward to. What would you like to share about leading with little h hope, that second hope that I spoke about?
One of the things has been a change in leadership for me, which is giving me, and I say this with all seriousness, but since we're talking about it, that's given me hope, is something that you introduced to me after we began to talk about a pathway in terms of making disciples. And I think you did some research and found someone who developed a hope cycle. Now, when we talk about hope, we're not talking about wishful thinking. Just let me do that. This isn't some wish for pie in the sky or whatever. This is actually a process that can bring about the hope that you're looking for. And that is, you know where you are, you know the situation that you're in, but you also know where you're going, right? What you want to accomplish, what the hope is. And that may be your goal. So if you think about where you are and where you want to go, the next question is, do you have the agency within yourself? Do you have the power, the resources or whatever to get from that place to the other? If you don't, what is it that you do need? And just know that along the path, you're going to run into barriers. There are going to be distractions. There are going to be things along the way that you have to navigate. And the question is, do you have it within you, or do you have the resources you need to get to that point? Now, with that being said, you're leading people now. So do the people with whom you're working have the agency or the resources to face whatever difficulties or barriers they are to take the next step, so that they can live into that, what we sometimes call God's preferred future? Do they have what they need? And so you as a leader are always asking yourself those questions. You're asking them the questions because there are always going to be obstacles. And what I've learned in the church is that some people, when they get to the obstacles, say, well, we've tried that and that didn't work. If you have your goal in mind, and let's just say that that's going to be the hope for the transformation of the world. It's a big one. But if you have that in mind and you walk down the street to the school and you can't see the principal and you can't see the guidance counselor, you don't come back and say, well, the school doesn't want us in. That's just a little barrier. You've got the agency of somebody sitting in your congregation that says, well, I know the principal personally. Why don't I just make a little phone call? And then you work on it from there. And eventually, with that kind of agency, you get to the place where you say, you know, we now have a ministry in the school. That's part of what I have in mind when I think about hope. And that you're always holding that where we're going in front of people. You know, here's where we are now. This is where we were a month ago. This is where we want to get. What else do we need to do to get there? And it's not easy. It's not supposed to be easy, but when it's finished, there can be a great celebration. And I can tell you right now, there's nothing better than having a leader who can say, let's go here. This is how we're going to get there. And then when you get there, everybody says, this was pretty good. Look what we did. And you worked all along to get it done. There may be something more with that, Sarah, but that's what that little h means, if we're going to do it that way.
Okay. So finish this sentence. With hope.
I'm going to say it sounds really cheesy, but with hope, all things are possible.
You just illustrated what hope is all about. So I do have one more question for you before we end this episode. When we talked about the mission in the first episode of this series, we also talked about leading change And I wanted to ask this question then, but saved it until we got to this episode on leadership. And I'm going to ask it in a couple of different ways, and you can take it where you will. Why is it important for a pastor or any ministry leader to be spiritually and mentally grounded when leading a congregation to become or to stay focused on the mission? And the other question, or another way to say it, is what wisdom would you offer to leaders for staying spiritually and mentally healthy? Recognizing, I know you're not a psychologist, and this can vary for different people. You get what I'm getting at. Often when leaders are not grounded and healthy, problems ensue.
You're right, Sarah. I'm not a doctor. I just play one in the church. The bottom line for me in answering that question, I mean, our whole focus, our whole work as being Christ-centered leaders is to live into and lead others into the mission, which again is God's business, and God's business is to love people through us. So if we have people who aren't healthy, leaders who aren't healthy, that's one of the things that in a study that I did when I worked at the general level was that the three things that every effective leader had was that they understood systems, they were able to work with staff, and they were able to keep themselves healthy. And the healthiness at that point wasn't physical health, although that's a biggie for us in the church, is being physically healthy. But that healthiness was that mental and emotional health. And it came at a point where when any of us get tired or get weary, we want to do anything else other than what we're doing. And when we start making decisions when we're weary, we do things like, can I just get out of this and start over again? And that doesn't help any congregation, that every time people like us, Christ-centered leaders, get tired and then we're not thinking the way we ought to be thinking, we want to get out of the situation instead of taking care of ourselves so we can lead through the situation. If there's any dysfunction at all we're doing is feeding the dysfunction. So it is important to me, and I've tried to tell this to others, that if you need time away, take the time away to get you thinking clearly, that you're breathing deeply, that you're seeing the world the way you ought to see it, then step back in this and you've got the agency to lead the people to where they need to go. When you give up the agency, it's because you're tired, you're weary, you've allowed yourself to become the center, and when you're in pain, the world shrinks. It shrinks all around your pain. And that becomes the only thing you look at. The world's much bigger than your pain. The church is much bigger than your pain. And if all you're doing is trying to lead out of your pain, that's not what Nowen talked about, the wounded healer. That's you're being dysfunctional. So so it's knowing who you are. It's being self-aware. It's knowing who you are. It's taking care of yourself. You have to do that. You can't work 24 hours a day. There'll be weeks you got to put 60 hours in, but there are other weeks you put 30. And just let it balance out. Take the time you need to be who you need to be. And one of the things that I've learned, and it's a pattern that, again, you shared with us, Sarah, that I've learned, the read, reflect, respond, and then return. I've used that return time more as reflection. And at the end of the day, when I'm tired and I've had a meeting and I just get all broken and irritated, if I don't take the time to reflect upon it, I'm off in some other world somewhere. But if I take the time to reflect and to think deeply about it, I can get back into balance. And so I think we mentioned this in a previous podcast about the reflection, that the reflection is extremely important. And I think that helps keep us grounded and healthy.
Thank you for that. So have to end the episode with my favorite question, and that's, what other wisdom do you have about leadership that you would like to share with our listeners? And while you're thinking on that, I'll remind our listeners that if you're not signed up to receive our Tuesday emails, head over to the show notes page and click on the button that says Notify Me. And there will be a simple little form that you'll fill out. And then every Tuesday morning, you'll get an email with information about the blog, the podcast for that week, and what might be happening on Transforming Mission. So did I delay long enough in giving you time to reflect on any other wisdom that you might want to share?
Sarah, the greatest job anybody could have is what I've had for the last 50 years. I did not start at where I am right now. I've grown and evolved into, I think, at least an adequate leader, and trying to incorporate the things that I've learned along the way. The things that I know that have been most helpful for me is just growing in depth in that love of God. And part of that love is for me as well as it is for others. I've had difficulty over the years just liking me, much less loving me. And then loving others as I've been loved. Finding ways to include people in my life that at times I would not have given the time of day, but now are the people who actually shape my life more. So that's what I'd want our listeners to know, is that wherever you are now won't be where you are 10 years from now. And take what you're learning, because I certainly would, as I've said before, it's not if I'd known then what I know now, I would have done things differently. It is, I wish I had the opportunity to learn the things back then that I'm learning now, and to associate with some of the people who I've allowed into my life that have shaped my leadership and my worldview in such a way that, if I may say it this way, into a person I actually like. So thank you for the opportunity. I need to tell our listeners, there is much to be learned from Sarah Thomas. And so when you go to the Transforming Mission page, there are places there that you need to go and learn from her. But there are other things around being a coach. And so be in contact with Sarah in terms of how you can become a better leader. That's the kind of work she does.
Oh, Tim Bias. Always deflecting. Deflecting to others. And I'm going to, I could edit it out, but I won't. I'll edit it this way by saying adequate leader. How about exceptional leader? And since I haven't said it for a while, you've been in ministry as long as I've been alive. And that ministry is continuing after retirement. And so there are still people that will have the pleasure of experiencing you as a leader, and you get to continue being shaped by them as well. So with that said, I think we're now ready for the benediction.
Well, friends, when you end this podcast, you're entering the mission field, wherever you are, where people need a kind, caring, supportive, encouraging word, and God's already put that word in you through Jesus. The joy and peace of this life comes in sharing what you've received, so go in peace to experience the joy and thank the living God who loves you in Jesus and who empowers you to be the leader that's needed for this time in history of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.